guy. His entire family is dedicated to family interventions. Indrani Suresh as well as the rest of them. I've been fascinated every time I hear him because every time he's putting up something new and interesting. I'm sure today's talk will be no different. I heartily welcome Dr. Suresh and welcome the rest of the people to join us. I'm sure more people will join. Thank you very much, sir. All yours, Suresh, sir.
Thank you, sir. Good morning. Thank you very much for asking me to participate in this session. It's certainly a delight. But before I begin, I would like to really dedicate this talk to all our fraternity members and our paramedical staff who have been fighting incessantly against this pandemic. I've seen personally very close. I've lost a few of my very close, and it's been an extraordinary, stressful time for many in the profession. But I'm sure, in spite of all that, what I have seen in the last 4 months is an explosion of academic activity. There are webinars happening all the time, and we have found a new way of learning. And this is really the spirit of the medical profession in India, where against all odds, we continue to learn. So thank you very much. And let's move on to today's topic on fetal therapy. And I'm going to restrict it to certain pediatric surgical conditions. Because today, fetal therapy is a very, very vast subject. You can have a 3-day conference on that itself. Now, let's have some general considerations first. We do fetal therapy for specific fetal conditions with significant risk to the fetus, where there is morbidity short-term or long-term, or mortality if untreated. So this is extremely important to do, because if the fetus can survive well, and then we can take care of it after birth without significantly increasing morbidity or mortality, we would like to wait and treat the baby after birth. Now, prenatal intervention can be done through the maternal route, percutaneous route, or open surgery. So today we will talk something about the percutaneous route. We anticipate to significantly improve outcome. By doing our surgery, whatever we do, we want to say that there is going to be a significant increase in outcome with acceptable success rates and minimal residual risk. And this is where the catch comes with identifying minimal residual risk and what is minimal, defining that, and explaining to the parent becomes really a challenge. So generally, fetal therapy is an alternative to fatalistic outcome, and maternal safety scores over anything at any point of time. So maternal safety is the core essence. So what we would like to do in fetal treatment, before fetal treatment, the first thing is to arrive at a precise diagnosis, where we need to be absolutely certain of the diagnosis. We can use high resolution ultrasound. We can also use fetal MRI in select cases. We also have to have a uniform scanning protocol to understand the natural history and to prognosticate outcome. Now, when I say uniform scanning protocol, for example, if you have to report on hydronephrosis, every person should report hydronephrosis exactly in the same way. We should all understand what are the cutoff values that are required, and also decision-making points of when to treat or not to treat. Looking at the outcome prognostication, we have certain parameters like the lung-head ratio, CCAM volume ratio, and fetal urinary electrolytes. And these are parameters which help us to prognosticate the fetus, saying this fetus could have higher morbidity or higher mortality. And these prognostic indicators help us to understand the outcome. When we treat a patient, sometimes we go and re-measure these parameters after treatment, which helps us to understand improvement in our treatment. The treatment goals prenatally is to do, one is prenatal correction. When I say prenatal correction, we do intrauterine treatment for anemia, fetoscopic laser surgery for twin-twin transfusion and other complicated twins, open fetal surgery for myelomeningocele repair, and some attempted tuber resections like sacrococcygeal teratoma, which has been done. We also do treatment to alleviate damage after birth, like treatment for due to either vesica-amniotic shunt or cystoscopy, thoracoamniotic shunt for hydrothorax, and fetoscopic tracheal occlusion for congenital diaphragmatic hernia. We also want to optimize condition after birth, like we give a very disease-specific surveillance, like cardiac defects, non-immune eye drops, supraventricular tachycardia. All these we'll follow after birth for the specific disease. And also exit procedure may be required in some cases, especially obstructive airway disease. Now, the other important thing is post-delivery care requirement. We need to be very cautious about it and we need to be aware about it. In cases of prenatal correction, neonatal treatment may be required only prior to discharge for residual disease. For example, RH. You treat the patient after birth. After some time, everything settles down. The patient need not, there's no long-term issues that we can see. So the long-term care is needed for only certain. For example, when you do fetoscopic laser surgery, these patients need to be looked at for neurological damage and need to do an assessment at 2 years of age. Similarly, for meningomyelocele repair, you need to do disease-specific surveillance. Now, the other two conditions where we treat in utero, we do condition-specific treatment is definitely required after discharge. For example, post-urethral valve, even if you treat antenatally, definitive correction needs to be done after birth. Same thing with diaphragmatic hernia. And short-term and long-term follow-up care will be required. So here the key messages are, once you do the treatment, it's important to know prenatal treatment. We are doing an intervention through the uterus. So high rate of preterm birth is expected when fetal therapy has been performed. So this is exactly where the challenge arises for the pediatric surgeon, because when the baby is born extreme preterm, to operate on a preterm birth, the risks are becoming very, very high. We are all aware of obstructive uropathy. Supposing they deliver the baby very early at 30 weeks, saying, okay, there is obstruction, now let us deliver the baby now, then treatment becomes much more challenging after birth as compared to a baby delivered at 35, 36 weeks. So sometimes we do therapy only to buy time. We need to buy time for better lung maturity so that the postnatal treatment, the baby will be able to handle it better. So obstetricians and neonatologists' understanding of the process is vital to manage maternal complications, to optimize the timing of delivery, and to help the couple understand neonatal issues, including the cost. So often what happens, the pediatric surgeon is involved in the antenatal counseling process. And for that, the pediatric surgeons should actually familiarize themselves with all the in utero presentations of these conditions and with the associated challenges that we face. The next thing is risk-benefit assessment of fetal therapy. The risk-benefit assessment actually depends on the accuracy of diagnosis. For example, again, I'll give you the classical example of post-urethral valve. There are a number of cases where it has been diagnosed as post-urethral valve, but ultimately turned out to be urethral atresia. So the differentiation between these two, in many cases, we will be able to make it out, but in some cases, we may not be able to make it out. So there'll be some element of uncertainty in the final diagnosis. Understanding of the natural history of the condition. What happens if you leave it alone? And I'll give you, illustrate with some example how natural history plays a role. And likelihood of treatment success. How successful will be the treatment I give? So when I put a vesica-amniotic shunt, I'm going to tell the patient, well, there is a 50% chance the shunt may get pulled out. Now, in that case, am I going to do a re-procedure? All those things must be discussed with the parents. The potential for unintended consequences due to complexity of the procedure, operator experience, and also caseload in a particular center. The most important thing is we have seen time and again that a procedure which goes extremely well can result in a bad outcome, or you can do a very complex procedure and it can result in a good outcome. because the factors deciding are much more than just the procedure alone. There are also complications of fetal therapy which we need to understand. It could be it's center specific based on infrastructure and expertise. It's also condition specific. Diagnostic procedures usually have a very low complication rate. Intrauterine transfusion has a 5 to 10% fetal loss, and shunt procedures you can have a losses of up to 40%, like PPRO, preterm birth, intrauterine fetal demise. Feto with balloon removal, the 47 to 50% risk of neonatal death if emergency balloon removal cannot be done. We'll discuss that in detail. Cardiac interventions, 10 to 30% mortality, and open fetal surgery, the risk of dehiscence, 2.3% full emergency facility. So we need to be prepared for all this before embarking on fetal therapy. And we need a team. The team consists of geneticists, high-risk obstetrician, fetal medicine specialists, anesthetists, neonatal pathologist, neonatologist, and the neonatal surgeon, and subspecialists. All are required to. We must ensure adequate infrastructure to ensure safety of the mother and fetus. The decision to intervene and the timing is the most difficult in many cases. When to intervene? Should I do it now? Should I do it a week later? What happens between the 1 week? Will something happen to the baby? All these are very, very, very important. There are also ethical and moral issues. It's very important to understand that the mother, the parent decide what they want. And she consents for a procedure, assuming that she is responsible. Now, supposing there's a bad outcome, and later on they may feel guilty for making a decision to intervene. And if they decide not to intervene and they have a bad outcome, they think that, oh, I should have listened to the doctor, maybe I should have done the procedure. So we'll just go through some of the instruments that are needed for fetal therapy. One, of course, is an 18-gauge needle on a 22-gauge needle. Many of the interventions can be achieved only by this, like amnio drainage or aspiration of urine or doing any minor procedures. Then we have shunting. For shunting, we require a shunt, which could be a Harrison shunt, as you see here, a double pigtail shunt, or a Rodex shunt, as you see here. Both are similar but slightly different in consistency. This stays in the uterus when the baby for longer than this one. And then we have a double basket shunt from Japan, which has got a double, like a Malicot on both sides, which is supposed to hold on to bed much better than the others. Then we can use it both for vesicoamniotic and thoracoamniotic shunts. Then fetoscopy is an instrument which we use. We use a 2 millimeter or 1 millimeter scope, especially for fetal cystoscopy. Then we have a light source camera monitor like any other endoscopy device. So this is a fetal cystoscopic unit. We have a curved scope and a straight scope. The curved sheath and the straight sheath, both of them are very sharp-ended, so that you can directly puncture it into the fetus. Then we have a diode laser, which is up to 60 watts. We use laser fiber of 400 nanometers or 600 nanometers, depending on the application. And like any other endoscopic device that holding is set up. Then we use 400 nanometer for doing interstitial laser. In specific circumstances, we want to ablate a single vessel. So we put an 18-gauge needle and introduce the laser fiber through that, and we achieve that. Now let's go for some case studies. We will stick to neck masses, thoracic lesions, and also lower urinary tract obstruction. Now, there are, as I told you earlier, there are decision challenges, there are technical challenges, there are ethical and counseling issues, and also evidence-based. Many of these procedures, the number of cases done is lesser. So we could talk to other colleagues who have done similar procedures, and evidence is just building for a number of, for example, cystoscopy, evidence is just building up for that. Now, fetal therapy, we must most important know when not to do anything. And so we will start off with the cases. First case is a neck mass. It's a primary referred at 30 weeks for growth scan. Prior scans were normal, and we found that she's got polyhydramnios, and the fetus was keeping his neck extended, and there's a very large solid mass in front of the neck. And then you can see this is the larynx, and that's the trachea. The trachea is quite compressed by the mass itself. So this looks like both lobes of the thyroid are enlarged, and there's a very, very large goiter with polyhydramnios. So the working diagnosis is fetal goiter due to hypothyroidism, and it's confirmed by maternal and fetal testing. So we work up the mother for the thyroid status. Some of them can be euthyroid also. The mother can be hypo or hyperthyroid on treatment. And we do fetal blood sampling and amniocentesis to do the fetal free T4 TSH. This baby's TSH was 29, which was very, very high. So the question of should we treat? She's 30 weeks. Too premature to deliver her. And if we treat, what are the costs? What are the implications? So fetal goiter actually presents late in second and third trimester. It can remain stable or increase in size. And ultrasound cannot differentiate between hypo and hyperthyroid goiter. And that's why we need to do an invasive testing to identify that. Now, once you evaluate thyroid function, the next issue is if I leave it alone, because a lot of hypothyroid babies are treated after birth. So why can't I leave it alone? The question will be, if the mass is very, very large, then there could be tracheal obstruction, and the baby may need intubation immediately after delivery, or you might even need to do an exit procedure. And that's why if there is some way we can reduce the size of the goiter in utero, then this may be better at birth. So for the treatment for that is giving intra-amniotic thyroxine. We just give 200 microgram of intra-amniotic thyroxine. The baby swallows the thyroxine, and then over a period of time, the goiter is expected to regress in size. And so intrauterine treatment may assist in preventing tracheal compression at birth rather than normalizing the thyroid function. So this is how pre-procedure can see fetal blood sampling being done, and through the umbilical cord, and then we are injecting intra-amniotic thyroxine, which is levothyroxine. It comes in 100 microgram vials, extremely expensive, but you need to repeat it every week because the half-life of thyroxine is only 1 week, and we try to push it for at least 10 days. For every 10 days, we keep repeating it. And then we repeat the sample for TSH and then see whether it is regressing or not. So this was the baby after birth. You can see a very large goiter, and she delivered at 37 weeks, elective LSCS. We needed an exit procedure. The baby is stable. TSH was almost 50 at birth. L-troxin was started, and the baby is now doing at 1 year of age. So this is just to say that this is a functional problem. And this functional problem has resulted in a large goiter, and the only concern we have is compression of the trachea. Now, we do not have concerns about whether the baby's IQ will be normal or no, because we don't have long-term studies to say in utero treated babies versus treatment at birth, whether hypothyroidism, the IQ increased or not. Now, here's another neck mass, which is very much cystic in nature, and very large cystic mass, and it was to one side of the neck. We found there was not much of tracheal compression. No investigations need to be done. No intervention is done. MRI may help to identify the trachea. We ensure airway at birth and gradual reduction by postnatal treatment. This is a large lymphangioma of the neck. So they are soft masses and they really don't do anything at all. So here you can see an MRI which has been taken to look for tracheal compression. Now, an exit procedure, of course, I don't need to explain the exit procedure to this audience. you might be knowing. So let's move on to the next issue, which is thoracic issues. In the thoracic issues, the most common condition we are going to come across is hydrothorax. Hydrothorax may be unilateral or bilateral, and we usually work up the patient for viral etiology like toxoplasma CMV. We do genetic testing to rule out karyotypic abnormalities. Sometimes we do a chromosomal microarray. We do the fluid analysis, and if we prove high triglycerides and lymphocytes, then we know that this is chylothorax. And this chylothorax can progress, can develop into hydrops, or can also regress. Even very large effusions like this can regress. So antenatally, our goal is this causing any other problem to the fetus? And in this baby, we find it has already caused ascites, and this baby has developed hydrops. So definitely this baby requires in utero treatment. So what are the treatment options that are available? One is thoracocentesis. We put a needle into the thorax, aspirate the fluid, and wait for it, because majority of them will recollect within 24 to 48 hours. We can also do serial thoracocentesis. If she's already 32 to 33 weeks, then we can do serial thoracocentesis and do one procedure just prior to delivery, so that there will be lung expansion at birth. Then we can also do thoracoamniotic shunting. People have tried injection of maternal blood to cause pleurodesis, and also injection of OK432, but that is not usually done in the in utero period. So here's a baby with severe pleural effusion. We did a thoracocentesis and immediately recollected post-treatment. But then we waited because there was no hydrops. At 29 weeks, the entire disappeared on its own, and the baby is doing well. One of the key issues about chylothorax is in utero, you can see repeated collection, but once the baby is born, this collection regresses and doesn't recollect again. So there are really long-term issues. Sometimes we might have to resort to thoracoamniotic shunting. We put a double pigtail shunt, especially the ones which are very large. You can allow it to drain, and very successfully it can be drained. So when you look at active management of pleural effusion, overall survival rate is about 65%, and experience with shunting is the largest, and with the pleurodesis, it is very, very small numbers are there. But thoracoamniotic shunting, we carefully follow up the patient. The moment we feel it is going into hydrop, we go and intervene. The next is congenital diaphragmatic hernia. Now, congenital diaphragmatic hernia, we know two major issues are lung hypoplasia and pulmonary hypertension. Prenatal detection is about 80% of the cases, and the time of detection can vary. The earlier you detect, the worse is the prognosis, or higher is the chance for lung hypoplasia. And we have various methods of diagnosis, like on B-board itself, we can see the heart being pushed to one side, or we can have vascular signs. So here is the abdominal aorta, and you can see the superior mesenteric artery is going upwards towards the diaphragm. So this means that the intestines have gone up, and the SMA is also taken along with that. And that's a very good indicator that this is a diaphragmatic hernia. We also have a deviated portal vein, which tells us that baby has got diaphragmatic hernia. And also the aorta can be deviated, as you can see. So important to make this diagnosis, because two things. One is liver the content, or is only small bowel the content? Second is how we are going to rule out karyotypic abnormality and associated abnormalities. And we prognosticate by lung size, liver herniation, pulmonary circulation, and also the stomach position. And in this assessment, one of the things we do is called lung head ratio. So what we do, we look at the lung area, and we take the lung area on the opposite side of the diaphragmatic hernia. So if it's the left side of diaphragmatic hernia, we look at the lung area of the right lung. And then what we do is we look at the head circumference. We divide the lung area by head circumference, which is called as LHR. But then that's not enough because this is gestation age dependent. So for each gestation age, the lung head ratio is different. So we do an observed lung head ratio divided by the expected lung head ratio, which is called as O by E LHR. And if the O by E LHR is less than 15%, then it is extreme pulmonary hypoplasia. There are no survivors. It's 15 to 25% severe pulmonary hypoplasia, less than 30% survivor, 26 to 45% moderate, 30 to 60% survivors, and greater than 45%, more than 60% survivor. So the question is, when you want to choose patients for treatment, in utero treatment, we always choose the ones with the most severe problem. That is, when the O by E LHR is less than 45%. Because if it's 45% or more, you'll already get more than 60% survival, which is what you will get after doing treatment also. So we choose the ones with severe pulmonary hyperplasia, and then the treatment is a mechanical treatment by tracheal occlusion. So we use a special fetoscope, which has got a side channel through which the balloon can be sent in. And we introduce a balloon inside the trachea and distend the balloon. So here is the you go into the baby's mouth. Of course, the baby has to be in the correct position with the face pointing upwards. The balloon is sent inside. This is similar to the cardiac balloon they use for balloon dilatation of the vessels. So here you can go there. It goes, just go up to the carina and then slightly withdraw it back, and then you deposit the balloon there and then come out. So on ultrasound, you can see the balloon as a cystic area, and it is supposed to prevent lung hypoplasia, keep the lungs dilated. So here is a study which showed 338 balloons inserted. They found the success rate was fetoscopic success rate is almost like 67%, and the balloon removal is done either fetoscopic guidance or ultrasound guided puncture. So just before delivery, the balloon needs to be removed, and otherwise, as soon as the baby is born, almost like an exit procedure, you must remove the balloon. They have shown that prior removal of the balloon has got a better survival rate as compared to removing at the time of delivery. So the challenge here is not only doing the procedure, but the patient suddenly goes into preterm labor. She's living far away, and when she comes back, the entire team must be available in the middle of the night, for example, to complete the process. So in most places, what they do, they insist the patient stays close by, and very close monitoring is done for doing optimal outcome. So when you look at outcomes, Feto increases survival rate from 24% to 49% in left CDH, which O by E LHR of less than 25%. From 17% to 42% in right CDH, which O by E LHR of less than 45%. Right CDH has got a lesser outcome as compared to the left CDH. Now, what about other thoracic lesions? If there are large, for example, here is a macrocystic CCAM. If that causes intense amount of mediastinal pressure and possibly potential high drops, then we might have to do aspiration of the cyst or cystoaneurysm shunting. It is reserved to very few cases. Now, here is a tracheal obstruction. You can see a dilated trachea, and this is congenital high airway obstruction with bilateral enlarged echogenic lung. People have attempted trying to do something for this, but invariably the outcomes are not very, very satisfactory. Recently in Kerala at Amrita Institute, they have done a procedure. The baby is survived, but the huge issues of how the repair is going to happen at the this thing. So The next is, of course, we are talking of congenital cystic adenomatous malformation. And when some patients, they referred as CPAM, but we need to look for bowel loops. It could be a diaphragmatic hernia. So diagnosis is very, very important. Now, when you're looking at CPAM, what is needed for prognosticating is called as the CCAM volume ratio. So what we do is we measure the volume of the CCAM, and we measure do it along with the head circumference. So this CCAM volume ratio is less than 1.6. The outcome is good. There's only a 2% risk of eye drops. If the CCAM volume ratio is more than 1.6, then the risk of eye drops is about 80%. So because we know that CCAMs can regress during in utero period. So we do watchful expectancy with masterly inactivity, and we intervene in those macrocystic CCAMs which really, really require something to be done. But on the other, one of the important things that we have to do with CCAM is we have to do a color Doppler and then ensure, even though there are macro cysts here, we find that there is a blood supply from the abdominal aorta, which means this lesion is echogenic in some areas, getting an abnormal vascular supply from the aorta, which puts us to the question that this is a hybrid lesion. It's a CPAM plus a pulmonary sequestration put together. Again, in such cases, wait and watch is the policy, because majority of them have good outcome. But when you come to bronchopulmonary sequestration, most do not require treatment, but in some you could have an associated pleural effusion or eye drops. And when you do that, we have a potential treatment here where you can put a needle into that the abnormal vessel, the systemic vessel which is supplying the BPS, and you can do an interstitial laser and do that. The results will be quite dramatic. There will be regression of eye drops and regression of the BPS, and outcomes are expected to be better. So if there's pleural effusion, then you need to do thoracocentesis. Some people have tried sclerosing injection therapy, but laser is the most preferred method of treatment for outcome, as almost a 93% outcome in this case. So it's a good procedure to do. Now, the last one I'm going to talk about is lower urinary tract obstruction. Lower urinary tract obstruction, today we use the term, we don't use the term posterior urethral valves, because a certain number of cases where we think it's a lower urinary tract obstruction because of posterior urethral valves, the diagnosis changes to urethral atresia. Now, as you all know, that the keyhole sign which you see here, the distended bladder, is not seen in about 30% of the cases. So the main questions we have when we have a distended bladder and bilateral hydronephrosis is the renal function preserved? How do we know that? We know that by looking at the LICA status. If there's oligohydramnios, we know that the renal function is significantly affected. Now, will these kidneys work long term? And that's $1 million question. And this is where most of the antenatal treatment challenges have come, that after doing the treatment, are we going to assure the patient that she will have the baby's kidneys will work well after birth? And that's something we are not able to do at this point. Will there be vesicular reflux? Majority of them will have a vesicular reflux, but to a varying degree. Again, it's difficult for us to predict how long will it persist. And I'll share some example of our own experience here. So severe oligohydramnios means this baby is likely to have lung hypoplasia. And we don't go and intervene in those cases because they are already completely, the survival rates are very poor. So when you look at the natural history of lower urinary tract obstruction, you can see hydronephrosis, but there could be a calyceal rupture with a paranephric urinoma, or there could be a bladder rupture with urinary ascites. Now, bladder rupture is a very different thing. If there's a perinephric urinoma, on one side there could be decompression, but on the other side, the kidneys still have hydronephrosis. Whereas when there's a bladder rupture, there is immediate decompression of the upper tract. And this potentially is reduce the pressure on the kidneys. But if this urine is not going to reach the amniotic fluid, then there's still going to be pulmonary hypoplasia and outcomes are not going to be very good. So the question is, how are we going to say that this baby will have the renal function is preserved? At present, even though it is not absolutely optimal, it is not the best method. The only method we have is to look at urinary electrolytes. And in the urinary electrolytes, we have now narrowed down to the urinary beta 2 microglobulin. We also can do fetal serum estimation of beta 2 microglobulin. If the urinary beta 2 microglobulin is less than 5 milligrams per ml, it's a favorable outcome. If it's more than 5 milligrams per liter, then it is an unfavorable outcome. Again, what we have to see is when I go and aspirate the urine in the bladder, this is urine which is collected over a period of time in an obstructed bladder. So usually the first sample is discarded. The patient is asked to come the next day for another sample and the following day for another sample. So 3 urine samplings are recommended before you get the true picture of the renal function. So, but as I said, this is something which is going to have a lot of invasive procedures. At the same time, if you are embarking on that, that's our only choice. So many years ago, I'm sure all of you would have read about this article, which is called the Pluto trial. They did a randomized control trial whether you should do treatment in utero for lower urinary tract obstruction or whether you can treat them after birth. So the results of the Pluto trial shows that if you do in utero treatment, you have a higher survival rate of newborns. But then the renal function is very low, irrespective of whether a shunt was done or not done. So the Pluto trial was stopped halfway. They said it's really no purpose in doing that. So there was a controversy whether to do treatment or not to do treatment. The world was divided, and they said well, some people believe in treating, some people said we don't believe in treatment. Because the first cases of lower urinary tract obstruction chosen for treatment were the worst cases with severe oligohydramnios. But then people started asking, why not you intervene early before the oligohydramnia sets in? So then a compromise has been arrived at, and you keep following up these patients. And when you see the Likert is coming down, those are the patients whom you choose for treatment, because some of them would actually do well even without treatment. So we choose patients which are severe enough to cause lung compromise and lung development. And if the Likert is good, the lung is developing well, then we keep waiting to do. Now, if at all we need to treat, this is going to be a vesicoamniotic shunt. We thread the shunt into the needle, and then we introduce the shunt into the bladder, and immediately after that, you can see drainage of the bladder takes place. The only problem about the complication of the shunt, this is the baby born with the shunt. The only complication of the shunt is that sometimes the baby, once the Likert becomes really good, the baby pulls it out. And once the baby pulls it out, again, the obstruction will be there. And maybe you might have to go and do a DT shunt for the baby. So 50%. So here's one shunt which got withdrawn from the abdominal wall, and it became a vesicoperitoneal shunt. So the urine is now getting accumulated in the peritoneal cavity. That's not good for us. There'll be renal decompression, but there will not be Likert accumulation. And for us, Likert accumulation is very, very important. So this particular patient was born with a shunt. It's 16 years. We've been following the patient for 16 years. The creatinine is now 1.1. There's minimal VUR, but the boy is doing very, very well. Right. Now, so lower urinary tract obstruction can be staged into stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. Once you do the staging based on renal anatomy, urine electrolytes, and amniotic fluid volume, then you can see that stage 2 and maybe stage 3 are the ones which we can choose for treatment. If it is stage 1, then we say no treatment, just wait. So stage 2, cat on the wall. At stage 3, yes, definitely we need to start treat the baby. And stage 4, really no point in treating because the kidneys are hyperechoic, renal cysts are formed, and this oligohydramnios which has formed. So it is ideal to take patients in stage 2 where the outcome can be a little bit more favorable. So here's a case study, but came at 24 weeks. They thought it was bilateral multicystic kidney, but this was a classical posturethral valve. You can see the keyhole sign. And this patient was 39 years old. And at 29 weeks, suddenly there was a bladder rupture. And now what do we do? There was complete renal decompression. Do we do something about it? We found the liquor was still present. So we did not do anything. We just waited and watched. At 30 weeks, you can see the hydronephrosis is not very significant. At 32 weeks, the kidney became quite normal, and the liquor was maintained. And the question is whether to deliver now or no. The liquor is coming down to around 4.5, whether to deliver or no. Now, we followed her up, and at 34 weeks, the clinician wants to plan delivery, but the urologist said 34 weeks, maybe since going is good, the kidney is all right, why not you wait for some more time? So ultimately, the baby was delivered at 36 weeks, 2.8 kg male baby, cystoscopic fulguration of the PUV was done, and the baby developed a right renal abscess, which needed treatment, 2 episodes of UTI in the first 4 months, currently 1 year old with a 41% and 59% zinc. So here is an in utero spontaneous decompression where we did expectant management. But on the other hand, this patient with obstructive uropathy suddenly developed oligohydramnios. Now the question, the patient wanted some sort of treatment to be done. So whether to do a shunting. Now if I have to do a shunting, yes, you can see an anterior placenta and I need to fill up the amniotic fluid with saline before I can put the shunt in. So we decided to do another procedure, which is fetal cystoscopy. So here using a 1 mm fetal cystoscope, we went into the bladder, we identified the posterior urethra, and then identified the valve, and I'm now using a 10-watt laser and to punch holes into the posterior urethra. So you can see that's a holes which have been punched there. So we punch about 3 or 4 holes so that there is immediate decompression of the bladder, and then we pull it out. So this patient did quite well, and this was postnatal. Dr. Sripati and myself, we did this case together, and here you can see the postnatal fulguration of the complete fulguration of the valve has been done. So this baby, within the urinary ascites resolved, the liquor volume improved, and the baby delivered at 35 weeks. We have now done about 3 cases with varying results, of course. And at 7 months, the creatinine, now it's about a year or so, the creatinine is 0.8, and the baby is doing well on follow-up. So the question comes is, you have 2 procedures, vesicoamniotic shunt or cystoscopy. And cystoscopy is a relatively experimental procedure. So which one is ideal? So some meta-analysis has come now. They've shown when you do vesicoamniotic shunt versus conservative or expectant management, the survival rate is higher with a shunt as compared to expectant management. But there's no difference in the 6 to 12 month interval or a 2-year survival and post-natal renal function. So vesicoamniotic shunt and cystoscopy was found significantly improved outcomes in the 6-month survival rate with posturethral valves. But when you do fetal cystoscopy, it has also improved postnatal renal function. And what is it that the advantage of fetal cystoscopy over vesicomatic shunt is when you put the shunt, the bladder is continuously collapsed and drained. So after birth, the bladder has to regain its function. So you're taking away the natural function of the bladder, and the bladder neck becomes hypertrophied. So whereas when you do a fetal cystoscopy, the filling and emptying of the bladder is maintained, and that is a very, very big advantage. So going forward, the problem today in fetal cystoscopy is the equipment is not very well suited, because we use a curve scope, and the negotiating into the post-urethra and visualizing the valve can be quite difficult. So that is the problem. So which we need. So at present, the latest information is a flexible scope has been designed, and it is currently under vision. So I mean under testing. So once we are able to do that, then I think in almost all cases of post-urethral valve, we will be able to correct it in utero and prevent renal damage. So the treatment for luto is aimed at survival. Shunting is in severe cases unlikely to improve renal function. Early evidence that cystoscopy may be beneficial, but still more data is needed. But optimal timing of the procedure is essential, and the luto phenotype may be different from PUJ with respect to renal parenchymal changes. We have significantly shown in almost our own series that those with PUJ obstructions, even bilateral PUJ obstructions, have much better preserved renal function as compared to lower renal tract obstruction. So obviously, when there is a lower renal tract obstruction, there's already some nephron damage which occurs very early on in pregnancy. Now, so this we have seen it already. Right. So next, I will take you to another condition you see here, a very large abdominal cyst. We didn't know where it was coming from, but it was causing severe polyhydramnion. So what we decided is to go and put a needle and aspirate the cyst. I mean, aspirate the cyst. Within a few hours, next day morning, it recollected again. So then we didn't know the origin. Then we sent the material, aspirate for beta 2 microglobulin, and it was greater than 12. So we realized that this is possibly urine. So we thought that could have been a calyceal rupture. So we put the patient on indomethacin to reduce renal function. And once we put the patient on indomethacin, we found remarkable reduction in the cyst size, and then the baby was delivered at 38 weeks, did not need a postnatal procedure, and the baby is doing quite well. So this is another example where we go very cautiously, and based on the findings that we have, we fine-tune the treatment. This is there are no known cases like this before, but it was a decision taken for that particular case based on the circumstance.
Sir,
the last one I'm going to show you is uretropsil.
End any time.
So here you can see a unilateral uretropsil with unilateral hydronephrosis. The other kidney is normal, Leica is normal, but we don't do anything at all. But I suppose here's the
Sorry, sir, just a minute.
Distended bladder. You can see bilateral massive hydronephrosis. Since the Leica was good, we still waited on that. But at about 25 weeks or so, we found that Leica started reducing, and the one kidney developed a paranephric pseudocyst. So the hydronephrosis was huge. The kidney cortex was becoming echogenic. So we realized that the intervention must be done. We had two choices. One is to put a needle inside the bladder and puncture and do a colandrization of the uretropsils, or do a direct vision procedure. So we chose the direct vision procedure, and here you can see once I put a 1 millimeter cystoscope into the bladder, you can see the uretropsil bulging there. And then using a laser,